Have you ever been working on a project and about, I don't know, 10 or 15 minutes into it, you realize you made a horrible mistake, you should have done it a totally different way, and you decide to scrap it, throw it away, get new materials and start over? Have you ever done that? I do it pretty much every time I shoot one of these videos, and that's basically what happens today in our discussion of the Constitutional Convention. Alright, as always, we're going to start off by saying, if you remember back to our last lesson, we'll link to it right here in the cards. No, yeah, it's going to be over here. We finished the last lesson by discussing the Annapolis and the Philadelphia Conventions. The Annapolis Convention was organized by men like Alexander Hamilton to encourage the states to send representatives to meet together to amend and change and improve the Articles of Confederation. Nobody really goes, and the Annapolis Convention's a failure, but they were successful in scheduling a later convention, the Philadelphia Convention. In 1787, several men representing all 12 states. Rhode Island didn't send a delegate. If you think about it, they didn't want the Articles of Confederation to change for some obvious reasons. If you think you know why they didn't want the Articles of Confederation to change, hit us up in the comments. Tell us your theory why Rhode Island didn't send a delegate to the Philadelphia Convention. Anyways, over time, up to 55 different delegates end up here at this convention, and they start off by amending the Articles of Confederation, but then they realize, you know what? We need a totally different structure. They pretty much scrap the nation's government and they start over again. And the main way that they approach this is by setting out a document that is referred to here in American history as the Constitution. Now, when we say the Constitution, that is Constitution with a capital C, and it's a Constitution with a capital C because it's our Constitution. And a Constitution is a document that sets up how the government is going to be run and gives it the basic laws for that government. So once all the delegates were in agreement that we needed a new Constitution, now the question is, what type of government do we want to set up? Obviously, the Articles of Confederation was kind of a dry run that proved to be inadequate in many different ways. But how do we now go about making a totally new government that accomplishes all of the things that the Founding Fathers wanted to accomplish? That was the key question here in the Philadelphia Convention, which becomes known in American history as the Constitutional Convention. So the Founding Fathers talked about lots of different governments. They knew they didn't want a monarchy. They didn't want somebody like King George III coming to power, but they couldn't go Articles of Confederation with no executive branch because Shays' Rebellion, all that good stuff. There's no good reason to not have an executive in charge of the country. But how do we keep autonomous states but still have a central government? And how do we mold these two together? They decided the best approach was to set up a republican style of government. You may recognize the term republic from Roman history. And a republic is a type of government that gives the people the power to elect representatives. So it's not a straight democracy like the days of Athens, Greece, where everyone has a say and they can all speak. It's a republic. You elect people to represent you, and then they vote on different things. And there's different levels, and this republic is going to look a little different than the Roman Republic, but it's going to look similar in some ways. Let's look at how the Founding Fathers set up our republic, our constitutional republic. So a constitutional republic was what we decided on. Now we got to figure out what level of representation are we going to give each state, each region. How is this going to set up? Like, we're electing representatives, but how many representatives does everybody have? You have 12 different states, and the delegates from those states are all discussing how this should be set up. You have smaller states that feel we should do it like the Articles of Confederation. We should have equal representation between a small state and a large state. That way the large states don't boss the smaller states around. But then on the other side, you have the larger states that feel most of the population lives in their states. So it just kind of makes sense that they would be more represented. So you have two different schools of thought here. You have two different plans that pop up. One is written by Edmund Randolph, and it's called the Virginia Plan. And in the Virginia Plan, each state would get representatives based off of the population that lives in that state. Sounds good if you're a large state, and lots of the large states backed the Virginia Plan. But then you have the New Jersey Plan, which was written and promoted by the delegate of New Jersey, William Peterson. And in the New Jersey Plan, each state would have equal representation, much like the Articles of Confederation did. So obviously, both of these plans have their supporters, and then both of them also have their detractors. How are we going to make these two work? And that's where you get a guy by the name of Roger Sherman. Roger Sherman was the delegate from Connecticut, and he comes up with the Connecticut Compromise. And in the Connecticut Compromise, or the Great Compromise, Sherman proposes a bicameral legislature. Instead of having one representative body based off of population or based off of equal representation, what if we had two houses, bicameral? two houses. One would have equal representation, and you might recognize that as today's United States Senate. The other would have representation based upon population, and you would recognize that as our House of Representatives. This is proposed by Roger Sherman. Both sides agree we can have representation based off of population. We can have equal representation so that the large states don't dominate the smaller states, while also disenfranchising the larger states. It seems like a match made in heaven, and the Great Compromise was the first step to actually securing agreement between the delegates here at the Constitutional Convention. The next major step that the Great Compromise kind of enacted just out of necessity was the need for a census. And a census is a counting of the population. It goes for figuring out how many representatives a state is going to get in the House of Representatives in our bicameral legislature. Then the census also is going to give you an idea for not only representation, but numbers for taxation as well. Because the central government is going to have the power to tax. That was one of the main weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. They couldn't tax, therefore they had no money. The central government had to have some strength, and the census was going to provide it with the information that was necessary. Well, now that we're talking about state populations, we get into the not so great compromise. In fact, really, the bad compromise would probably be the best way to say it. Now that we were discussing population, the topic came up of what counts as a citizen here in the United States. Obviously, the higher your population, the better your representation in the House of Representatives. So you had states in the South, especially, that wanted to count their slaves towards their population. But then you had states in the North that didn't think that was fair because those people aren't citizens of the United States. They are slaves of citizens of the United States. However, in interest of gaining more representation, the Southern states pushed the slave population to be included in the census for counting, for representation, and for taxation as well. And the compromise that they come up with this one is known infamously in U.S. history as the Three-Fifths Compromise. And basically what it said was that a southern state or a state that had slaves in it could take their entire citizenship population and then add 3/5 of the population of their slaves, and that would be counted towards their entire representation. Obviously, this is sending some huge unbiblical messages of inferiority between God's created people. It's embedding the language of slavery into the United States Constitution, although thankfully it's definitely been amended since. We see here that the Three-Fifths Compromise was an unfortunate result of the economy and beliefs about slavery at the time. So the Constitutional Convention is running fairly smoothly at this point. The delegates are speaking openly about what they think is going to help our country work together the best. However, there's one key issue that's still yet to be solved, and that is how do we divide the powers? How do we keep our states autonomous but also make a central government strong enough, but then also keep that central government from being too strong like it was in England to where they can now oppress people? The Founding Fathers are kind of having to do a delicate balance of separating the powers into different areas of the government. But one thing that all of the Founding Fathers could agree upon is that they did want a very limited government when they were creating the Constitution. And what we see here is four basic principles that show up in our Constitution for limited government. Let's go ahead and take a look at those together. The first principle of limited government that you can find in our Constitution is the idea of written law. And this goes all the way back to our English heritage, 1215. King John signs the law, the Magna Carta, the Great Charter at Runnymede. That idea and those ideas and principles carry all the way here into the 1700s as we are starting to remake our nation at the Constitutional Convention. Written laws had to be part of this equation. It's the only thing that could actually limit the powers of government officials. So written law was built into our Constitution from the get-go. The next principle that we see in our Constitution that encourages limited government is the idea of the separation of powers. This comes a lot from the French thinker Montesquieu. And the separation of powers basically created three different branches of government in our republic, very similar to the Romans. All right, and we had our executive branch, our legislative branch, and our judicial branch. And each of those branches have different powers that they are totally in charge of. And some of these powers overlap with other branches, but each of these branches has their own distinct sphere of influence that they're seeking to govern in. And that's the concept of separation of powers. No one branch becomes more powerful than the other, or at least it shouldn't. The fourth principle for limited government that you can find in the U.S. Constitution is the idea of checks and balances. Now, this goes along with the idea of separation of powers, but each of the branches and each of the institutions in our government are created to check and balance each other. Think about the easiest way to solve any sort of argument or dispute. Are you thinking? If you're thinking with me, you're thinking of a game. And that game is rock, paper, scissors. Rock, paper, scissors is the ultimate equalizer. I mean, basically you have three moves and only three moves. Now, you might play that dumb version with like the time bombs. There's only three moves. And each move can be defeated by one move, but it can also defeat the other move. And that's the same idea. The checks and balances system in our government, in our Constitution, is like a game of rock, paper, scissors. The legislative branch can overrule the executive branch from time to time, who can overrule the judicial branch. The judicial branch can declare laws unconstitutional. There's all kinds of ways that each of these branches can check and balance each other, can cancel each other out. And the fourth principle of limited government found in the United States Constitution is the idea of federalism. Federalism was necessary in order to give us a strong central government that could take over certain responsibilities, that could be in charge of different things, while also not infringing upon the limited state governments, was a huge concept to our founding fathers. And so the federal system that they created took all the powers that could possibly exist in government and they divided them. All right, they gave some of these powers to the state governments, and these are usually things that require more local leadership and more local enforcement. And then they take other things like the ways that states relate with each other, international relations, and they give those powers to the federal government. That way, the state of Illinois doesn't have to sign a treaty with another country. That's a power reserved for the United States, and they speak for all of us. But if there's a very specific thing going on in the state of Illinois, the Illinois state government is going to take care of that, or they're going to delegate it out to the other local governments to take care of that. The federal system that the founding fathers created still preserved state autonomy, which was a huge deal to these 12 to 13 if Rhode Island gets its case together. But the idea of state government retaining power is a huge deal to these states because at this time they're so very diverse in economy, in location, in problems and interests that giving them the ability to govern themselves was a huge part of the federal system. But having a strong enough central government that could put down things like Shays' Rebellion and deal with treaties and deal with foreign invasion and aggression, the federal system can kind of be a compromise between both of those two camps. Now, there were still people who thought that the central government was given too much power, and there were still people that thought the states did not have enough power. But again, these compromises come together and accomplish lots of things politically speaking here in the Constitutional Convention. And so now they have this document, they're ready to ratify it, they're ready to send it out to the states and the people and see what people think about this new Constitution that they had assembled, all from the Philadelphia Convention that turned into the founding of our nation and our government as we know it today. An important little side note here from this whole thing is while they're discussing all this, you have 12 different states that have 12 very different interests, okay? But in this time, there are no political parties. In fact, George Washington himself advised against political parties in his farewell address because he wanted the American people not to seek the best results for their political party, but to seek the best results for their nation as a whole. And I think there's a message here in what the Founding Fathers did and how they related with each other for how we as Americans today can help our nation to be the strongest and the most unified that it can be. We need to seek what is best for America and for all the people that that entails, because our Founding Fathers, despite many of their flaws, they're humans, they screw up too, but they did give us a government. They gave us a republic, if we can keep it, like Benjamin Franklin told us. They gave us a republic so we can work out many of these things if we seek the best interests for all Americans and not just for ourselves. I hope you learned a little something today about the Constitutional Convention. We'll talk to you in the next lesson. See you then. Hey, you made it through another video, but I know you're not subscribed. And if you are, good for you. But if you're not, come on.